Hello, puppies and kittens. I was reading through some articles. People always send me, creationists like to send me things that, disprove evolutionism and, how they are. And so some of the articles that I've gotten from Answers in Genesis is always shameful. It's just like, what I mean by shameful is that you know that they know that they're misrepresenting the data however they can. And I know going in a handful of things, I know that. Well, I'm about as confident as one can be that there is no God, nor is it even possible. That doesn't mean that there isn't some guiding, force to some things. Maybe could be, but it's not the Bible God. Even if there was a God, then the Bible would still be wrong. We know that the Tower of Babel didn't happen. We know that Adam and Eve didn't happen. We know evangelical Christians who are trained in science admit that Noah's flood never occurred, that Exodus never happened, that Moses didn't exist, and all of that, right? Even believers, even rabbinical scholars and Bible scholars admit that these things did not happen, that the Bible is mostly folklore, right? So going in, I know intricacies about evolution and such that these people haven't even addressed. I know that the Earth is not 6,000 years old. I mean, I know that these people know that on some level, if we had a time machine, it could go back in time, we would be able to go back quite a long ways further than they think the universe exists. Or should I say, then they pretend that the universe exists? Because I have talked to some of these people who confess on rare occasions that that they know that what they believe is not really true, but they believe it anyway for whatever reason gives them comfort or something. I mean, one guy was telling me today that what he likes about creationism is the feeling of certainty. But if you're wrong, why would you want to be certain about it? But so anyway, Answers in Genesis writes these stories that appeal to people who don't want to know the way things really are. They just want to believe, and so they want somebody to reinforce that delusion that, for whatever reason, however, gives them some kind of feeling of comfort, which I can't begin to fathom. Anyway, the first of these arguments that we're going to be addressing today, and I have Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale, working with me today, and he is a geneticist, and we've worked on a couple of projects together and have been very fruitful, I think. So, Dan, what do you think of the article that says genetic evidence for 3 daughters-in-law of Noah?
So, first of all, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it, and I love getting emails like this where it's like, hey, here's what they said. Can we talk about why this makes no sense? And then I see this lovely phylogenetic tree pops up saying that we have genetic evidence for the daughters-in-law of Noah. So a little background for everybody. You have the flood. It's Noah and his wife, their 3 sons, and then each of the sons is married, so the daughters-in-law. And what young Earth creationists claim is that we can do the phylogenetics for the mitochondrial DNA, and you can find 3 distinct kind of groups in that genetic history of the mitochondrial DNA, and they point to those groups and say, okay, those represent kind of the descendants of each of those daughters-in-law.
And I need to interject for just a moment. Remember that for continuity, Answers in Genesis, they did the Ark Park, and if you go to the Ark Park, they give names to these women because the Bible doesn't bother to give names to their female characters. I mean, there's like 4 very few more than that. The female characters were prominent enough to have names. Most of them are just somebody's wife or daughter, or they're not mentioned at all. Like we are to assume that Adam and Eve had daughters that ended up in incestuous relations with one of their brothers, but we don't get to know their names. Right. So, and that's the way most of it is. But, we know that one of Noah's daughters-in-law, for example, is called Ariel, because Answers in Genesis decided to name her after a Disney character because one of the children suggested that name. And so they put that name on the plaque, that is her name now. And their argument, much like their argument for everything else, is, well, you can't prove it's not her name.
It's true, we can. It's true. You can do it.
Yeah, not being able to prove that it's not somehow means that it is. That you can just declare that
Right.
this is that's what it is. So that's part of the argument. Well, the other thing that they say is that the origin of the three races, and that's a whole other body of questions, because people have historically over the last couple centuries or so been arguing over how many races there are, or in fact, are there any races? And while Ken Ham has just recently started to say that we are all one race, that we're all the human race, he's a little bit behind Darwin, who had already said that. Unfortunately, Franz Boas was famous for being the first one to say that there are only one human race, but he said it in a T-shirt, bumper sticker, sort of a quotable quote, whereas Darwin explained that in an entire page of paragraphs. But Darwin did say it first, just not quite as succinctly. But the other thing that Ken Ham is arguing about is our perception of race, however many that's supposed to be. He's decided that there are three, and I guess he's decided that because Noah had three daughters-in-law, and so black, white, and brown people come from those three daughters, and that's just what they've arbitrarily decided the fact to be. So go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
So if I can, the way they interpret this Y chromosome phylogeny, it makes no sense. So what I have here, if I can share my screen, I'm going to pull up the actual kind of paper that is referenced here. It is called "Out of Babel, Not Africa: Genetic Evidence for a Biblical Model of Human Origins" by Jeff Tompkins.
I don't have your screen to share yet.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up right now. Okay. So now that we can see this tree here, what the creationists claim is that these 3 points, kind of where a bunch of other branches radiate outwards from, these 3 points represent the 3 daughters-in-law of Noah. Now, there's a couple problems here. Just one is kind of a conceptual problem with how phylogenetics works, and one is just a very simple reading the tree wrong kind of problem. So the conceptual problem is that phylogenetics is all about populations, not individuals. So all of these lines, all of these nodes, a node on a phylogenetic tree is just a branch point anywhere it splits. That's called a node. Those represent populations of individuals where you have a group of individuals, and then that group separates into 2 or more distinct lineages that are no longer interbreeding with each other. That's what happens at each branch point. So you have these 3 distinct points right here. AIG and other creationist organizations claim that they represent 3 individuals, but that's just conceptually misunderstanding how phylogenetics works. Those represent populations. They represent groups of individuals.
I think I might have an explanation for that, because in Ezekiel it says that Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to destroy the city of Tyre, and was also supposed to destroy Tyre's daughters on the shore. And while it says daughters, it actually means cities. So the biblical scholars will tell you that it's daughter towns, so that each one represents a population. Just wanting to throw that in there, because it's just a jab at the way these people misinterpret things, often on purpose.
Gotcha. The other error is a bigger problem, though, because what they claim here is that these nodes, 1, 2, 3, represent 3 individuals who lived at the same time, right? They lived simultaneously. They weren't related to each other. They couldn't be closely related to each other, because otherwise they wouldn't be genetically distinct from each other. So they have to be 3 unrelated individuals living at the same time that all married Noah's sons.
And they're already genetically distinct.
The problem is the lines on a phylogeny. All these lines represent descent. So anytime you have a line connecting one node to another node, that line in your head you can replace with the words descended from. You'll notice that these 3 nodes are directly connected with lines in the middle. So that means when you do what's called rooting the tree, which is where you set a direction to it. You say, here's where the common ancestor is, and here's the direction. So here's where it's more ancestral, here's where it's more recent. This tree is called unrooted, where you're not doing that. You're not picking an evolutionary direction. You're just saying patterns of relatedness, but you're not saying where kind of the beginning is, right? But when you root a tree, which you have to do if you're going to kind of determine like clades, which are groups where you have all the descendants from a common ancestor. If you're going to do that, you need to root the tree to have an evolutionary direction to it. Now, if you look at these three nodes, they're connected by lines, which means you don't have three individuals living at the same time here. What you have is, for example, maybe the root is somewhere over here. So you've got a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. Maybe
you
the
don't
root's
mean,
in the middle.
again, you don't mean literally, you mean
Right.
descendant populations.
Right. But let's put aside that misunderstanding and let's just pretend it's three individuals. Let's forget the first error. Sure, it's three individuals. They're not three people of approximately the same age that are unrelated to each other. It's parent, kid, grandkid, or it's parent, sister, sister, or like maybe you root it somewhere in between here, right? So it's like going to be one kid this way, then the other kid this way, and then a daughter this way, and then this individual is this one's aunt, for example, right? There's no way to root this tree given this pattern of relatedness to get a situation where these three nodes represent three unrelated individuals living at the same time, because the lines connecting them indicate descent.
So what you're saying
in whichever direction.
Ancestors in Genesis wants to represent these as three different individual people, unrelated to each other, all living in the same time, when in fact these are three whole populations that are related to each other and do not live at the same time. So that every part of the Genesis, or every part of Ancestors in Genesis interpretation is wrong.
Yes. Yes, exactly. and bonus, they do this exact same thing with the Y chromosome. They do the exact same thing. So this is for the mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the mother's line. The Y chromosome is only inherited through fathers and sons. And they'll do the same thing with Noah and the three sons, where they'll make a very similar type of evolutionary tree, or they don't really make it, but they'll take it from somewhere else. And they'll be like, look, three central nodes, three sons. It's like, it's not how you read that. It's not how that works. So it works. This is specifically for mitochondria, but they do it for both.
So give me an idea what it would look like in the case of the Y chromosome, in the case of my three sons. Aren't you going to have, even if it was three women that I understand that the genetics show that they are definitely related as opposed to, the unrelated individuals that we're talking about. But if we were to assume that it was three individual unrelated women, one Asian, one Middle Eastern, one white, or whatever mix Ancestors in Genesis thinks they need to come up with in order to justify what they perceive as races today. What would happen when it's three definitely related boys, all of the same father, genetically in this mix, and it's all of humanity coming from this one? I mean, it would be coming from Noah and these three girls, basically, right?
Right. Yeah. So you have the genetics in Noah and his wife plus the three daughters-in-law, and those are your sources of all of your allelic diversity that you're going to get. And then what you need to have would be the hypothesis that creationists use is created heterozygosity. So you have a lot of diversity kind of built in, and then lots of recombination. If everyone thinks back to like high school bio class, where you talked about how chromosomes do like the little crossing over thing, you have to do that a lot at speeds that are orders of magnitude faster than it actually happens, that we like observe it to happen, in order to get all of the different combinations that exist today.
It's funny that
doesn't work.
Creationists will argue that they believe in microevolution but not macroevolution. But when it comes to Noah's Ark, whether they're talking about other animal species or whether they're talking about the human species, they believe not just in macroevolution but in mega evolution.
Warp speed evolution. Yeah, it's right. You get off the Ark, and within a few hundred years, you need to have basically all the extant species. So like you look at
as fast as those animals can run or swim back to their home continents.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at like Egyptian hieroglyph, Middle Kingdom Egyptian hieroglyphics. You got all the different cat species are already existing, all the different raptor species are already existing, waterfowl. Like you could go through all these different kinds and see that by Middle Kingdom, which is only a few centuries after the flood supposedly happened, you already have all these species happening, plus all the extinct ones that happened in between and then went extinct.
Yeah, well, you say a few hundred years, but it's not even really that, because they believe that they put a date on it. there's 3 different creationist organizations who all put dates close to each other, and they're all
Mhm.
roughly at 24th century BC. They're
Right.
all right at the 5th dynasty in
Yeah.
Egypt.
I always say Middle Kingdom as an example because you get further back than that and you get into the point where the Egyptians are sitting there wondering what's going on while the rest of the world is under a flood. And it's weird that that's just, there's no record of such a thing happening in all those earlier dynasties going on. So you do bump up against the Egyptian chronology very quickly.
Okay, and not just them, but the
Yeah.
Mesopotamian
Oh yeah.
and Chinese and so on,
Right.
and then archaeological evidence from just like all over the world, Australia, South America, and so on, because
Yeah.
we know that there were people in those places, and that the people that were there then are directly related to the people that are still there now. So there
Yes.
can't have been a worldwide flood, but the people who believe this flood have to make believe this flood somehow. Their identity, their existence, it depends on them making themselves believe what they gotta know can't be true, but they're going to believe it anyway. And I just don't understand that kind of psychology. So okay, so there was a related article.
Yes.
Y chromosome study confirms Genesis flood timeline. Now
Yep.
I've already seen many genetic studies that like do put the molecular clock on genetic divergence between different lineages, and they're pretty accurate when they start comparing this to the fossil evidence that they've got
Oh yeah.
mutation rates. The significant mutation rates are pretty much on the ball for
Mhm.
all of these genealogies. But
Yep.
all of a sudden, Answers in Genesis has mysteriously won the Nobel Prize, for which they didn't get credit. I wonder why, by overturning all of standard genetics with this bullshit article. So why don't they have the Nobel? Why do
Yes.
people? Why is the scientific community not all on their knees in prostration at the moment? I don't get this.
So what's going on here is they do a simple little trick. They this requires a little bit of background, so I apologize to everybody, but just kind of when you're doing phylogenetics, when you're making phylogenetic trees, you're looking at the evolutionary histories of groups. The way you do that is you compare sequences in living things, right? You're surveying, for example, all, in this example, human Y chromosomes. They're saying, okay, how many differences do we see? And what specific differences do we see across all the Y chromosomes that are out there today? And given how fast differences accumulate in the Y chromosome over generations, how long does it take to get all the differences that we observe? And what the creationists do, and specifically this one, the second paper is by again Jeffrey Tompkins, but he references work by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, who's AIG, and then it's actually the third one in here as well. If you want to just read the title of that one real fast, it's the same thing.
The third article you're talking about, I think you're referring to New DNA Study Confirms
That's the
Noah.
one. That's it. So those two both reference the same thing by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And what he does is he takes the Y chromosome and he looks at what's called pedigree studies. So pedigree studies are when you compare parents to offspring and you look at the genetic differences. And by the way, I just realized how I sound. I apologize to you and your audience. I'm getting over a cold, so I sound like death. But
Yeah, we know you got COVID and you're going to die any minute, but that's okay.
right. So so what he does is he says, okay, dad and son, because again, we're talking Y chromosomes. So you're looking at dad and son, how many differences? And you do this across a lot of parent offspring pairs, and you calculate a per generation mutation rate. And then what Nathaniel Jeanson does is he extrapolates that rate backwards infinitely. So he says, okay, you get X number of mutations per generation. You have, say, the number he comes up with is 3 mutations per generation. So he says, okay, if you've got 30 differences, then that's 10 generations, right? From an ancestral to a living thing. Those 30 differences are 10 generations.
And what documentation does he provide for this? Because I mean, I was able to find that that humans have an average of 128 mutations per zygote, and
So
he's coming
that's
up with 3.
so 3 specifically for the Y chromosome. So
Okay.
that's only for the Y chromosome, not the rest of the genome. Yeah, it's about 100 to 120 mutations per person per generation, but that's genome wide. It's about 3 in the Y chromosome. But here's the problem with what he's doing. You have all these mutations that occur, but if you go 5 generations, 10 generations, 100 generations, most of those mutations are gone from the population. So you can't just have a linear mutation rate and extrapolate that backwards. Because what matters, as I said a few minutes ago, is the mutation accumulation rate. It's the rate at which new mutations occur, and then they reach what's called fixation, where within a population, everybody has it.
Well, that's a good explanation, because the studies that I was talking about were not counting like the mutations that every zygote has in it. They were talking about significant mutation rates, and I was wondering what they meant by significant mutation rates. And apparently, I mean, what you're describing is very similar to what I read. It sounds like they're talking about retention, where they become significant because they're retained.
Yeah, it's called, so the long-term rate of accumulation is called the substitution rate. So you have the mutation rate, which is the rate at which mutations occur. And then you have the substitution rate, which is much slower. That's the rate at which mutations accumulate over time. Excellent. The rate at which they get stuck in the genome. Now, when you're doing what's called coalescence analysis, when you're working backwards in time to calculate what's called the time to most recent common ancestor, so you take any 2 people on Earth, you look at their Y chromosomes, say, okay, how different are they? Let's work backwards. How far in the past do they share a common genetic ancestor? You need to use the substitution rate for that, not the mutation rate. Because most mutations that occur in a generation are lost from the population.
And this would be explained by the parent. The way that I commonly put it is that the parent gene pool does more to inhibit new expression than that in a smaller population you get a chance to get more expression.
It could be
new mutations. Is that right?
It could be either way. So you could have natural selection, where if you have a mutation that causes an issue, it doesn't have to kill you, just has to make you a little bit less likely to reproduce. And then maybe somebody with that mutation doesn't have any sons. Okay, now not just that mutation is selected out, but any other mutations in that lineage have also been selected out that were unique to that lineage. You could also just have genetic drift, which is random changes. Like, just by chance, maybe someone has 4 kids, but they happen to have 4 daughters. Now their Y chromosome lineage is extinct. No one's inheriting their Y chromosome. It doesn't mean there was a mutation that hurt them or anything. It just meant, flip a coin enough times, you're going to get an improbable run, right? That's just how it happens. And so you have to consider these things when you're comparing your per generation rate, the pedigree mutation rate, to the long-term substitution rate. And we could actually graph this out and check it against real life events. Like, we know, for example, when certain islands were colonized from mainlands within the last 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years. And we know where the 2 parent populations are. So we could actually check, okay, we construct this curve where we know the 1 generation rate is very high. And then we know we're going to lose that variation over generations, and you converge on that long-term substitution rate. Well, we can plot points on that curve to validate that curve. And that's exactly what we've done.
And this also works with the different groups in migration leading to those islands, because you have
exactly.
Help me. What is, I forget the name, when you have a small population that makes it from the major group, they go to this place, they have their unique signature. Founder effect. Thank you.
Yep.
And so you can trace the entirety of human migration that way, and clock it in time.
Mm-hmm. And you can coordinate it with archaeological evidence. So, for example, we have Stone Age burial sites all over the world. We can recover DNA from that, and then say okay, what's the Y chromosome? What Y chromosome mutations do we find here at this thing that's dated to a certain point in time, and how does that specimen differ from the populations that are descended from that individual's population, that skeleton that we found in the burial site, right? We can have things that are dated independently of the genetics using radiometric dating or archaeological means or whatever, right? We have lots of independent means of dating them that we could use to cross-check and reference each other. And if we see a major conflict where we radiometrically date something to 10,000 years ago, but then the genetics tell us that it's way younger than that, then did they put the skeleton in there, in the tomb Separately, like what happened there? You're like, when there's problems, it jumps out like, it just boom, big red flag. Something is wrong here. Well, we
All
keep
of that can
finding,
be easily explained by assuming that there's a vast global cohesive conspiracy of the Illuminati
yes,
that has been going on for thousands of years to hide all the
yes,
evidence.
all the sciences are just conspiring, and it's kept perfectly secret for anyone not in the club. Yeah.
Gotcha. So
Millions
how
of
does all
people
of this
keeping the
relate?
secret.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
How does
So,
all of this relate to the 3 articles we've brought up so far?
yes. So I know that was a lot. So what Jeanson does in this article is I'm going to just show one figure here. And I promise I won't screw up the screen share this time. Okay. So this is, okay. So this is from this paper. This is Nathaniel Jeanson, all the way to the top. Evidence for human Y-chromosome molecular clock pedigree-based mutation rate suggests 4,500, whatever. This is the key. Pedigree-based mutation rate. So he's using the 1 generation rate to extrapolate backwards, as I was just talking about. So come down here, and he has these figures where he has the young Earth timescale and the actual evolutionary route mutations accumulated per branch, basically. So how many mutations do you see in there? And basically he's saying, look, in this measure, you can't distinguish between them, is the point he likes to make. He's saying, we can't distinguish. But look at this. If we have our 4,500 year molecular clock here with those observed mutation rates, here are the predicted number of mutations we expect to see given those faster mutation rates. But here's what we actually see, and you can catch just a little bit of the text right above it. Should have accumulated 8 to 59 times more mutations than we actually see. So he's saying this is what evolutionists expect to find if you use the correct mutation rate, and this is what we actually find, which means there's too few mutations. The timeline must be much shorter. That's the case he's making here, and it's not more sophisticated than that, really. And it comes down to this very simple conflation of those per generation mutation rates compared to the long-term accumulation rates.
Okay, so he's not doing what you talked about, the retained mutations, or what I had described as significant mutations. Okay, so he's taking the 128 mutations per zygote and counting all those back.
Right. He's doing it specifically for Y chromosomes, but yeah, exactly. Just saying you get this many per Y chromosome per generation. Well, if you just multiply that by like the evolutionary time span, we should have 50 times the variation we see in human Y chromosomes. There's no way the evolutionary timeline can be correct. It needs to be a much more compressed timeline. And wouldn't you know it, you get about 4,500 years correlating with Noah as the most recent common ancestor.
I think the audience should know that one of the things that you have to do in order to be a scientist for Answers in Genesis, there is a document that you have to sign, that you have to swear to, wherein you can never admit anything that contradicts the Bible, ever. You have to support the religious extremist young earth creationist perspective or interpretation of biblical literalism. It can't just be biblical literalism. You have to accept their interpretation of it. And that's how they get around the flat earth and what the firmament really is. I mean, they have interpretations to get over all these things, and you must adhere to all of that. And you cannot ever contradict what the other apologists commonly agree to. You will get contradictions. I mean, you have Paul Garner and Andrew Snelling disagree with each other on whether Acanthostega was designed for walking or designed for swimming. But just because they're not conferring with each other and they don't care about that thing that they're talking about, they only care about supporting the interpretation that the Earth is only 6,000 years old and magicked out of nothing by an incantation spell. That's what they care about. And you sign this document that you must do this. And then they go through all of these, background checks wherein they want to talk to your ministers and get your entire past experience to make sure that you're not trolling them, or that make sure that, you're not somebody that's going to come onto their payroll and then expose some deception that they're constantly engaged in. They want to make sure that everybody's completely online with, towing the fallacy that they're promoting.
Yep.
It is as dishonest an organization as it can be without being organized crime.
Yeah, it's the statement of faith for employment is a real problem for an organization that purports to be doing actual scientific investigation. Sure.
Because there's no way to falsify it. There's no way to test any of this.
Yeah.
There's no. Yeah. And so there's one third article, or excuse me, there's a fourth article that we haven't yet mentioned, where this one is from creation.com. This is Adam, Eve, and Noah versus modern genetics. Because they always want to pretend that it's science against the evolutionists, because they have to pretend that we're the religious extremists and that they're the rational ones, because everything has to be juxtaposed and they have to project all their own faults onto others who will not share them. They have to pretend that we are the ones who believe on faith and they are the ones that have the evidence.
So this one is really easy because there's this one. Well, it's older. This is from Rob Carter at CMI, Creation Ministries International. And if you don't know the history of AIG and CMI, everyone look that up because that's a fun story. But so this is from CMI, Rob Carter. It's older than the other ones now. So this is from 2010, and there's nothing in here that we haven't talked about already. This is the same exact arguments, except less specific, because back in the Stone Ages of 2010, we didn't have a lot of the genetic data that we do now in 2022.
I mean, that was a dozen years ago.
In genetics, in human DNA sequencing time, that was a long time ago. So we actually, Dr. Carter in this piece has a lot less specific stuff to build on in terms of specific studies and full phylogenies and things with lots of humans involved in it, because we've just sequenced so many more human genomes between now and then. So it leans on the same couple of things, like having the 3 sons with the Y chromosomes, the 3 daughters with the mitochondrial DNA. It leans on the same information, but there's nothing specific in it. Like there's no figures that I can pull up and be like, here's the specific thing, because there's just less data to deal with back then. So we don't need to deal with it specifically because it's kind of been superseded by the other stuff that was referenced. And that stuff was just wrong because they did the mutation rate versus substitution rate error, which Dr. Jensen does all the time, just invalidates everything he does. There's the misreading the phylogeny. So having those 3 central nodes where they claim they're separate individuals, but they're actually showing a pattern of descent, one then the other, depending on how you set the direction in the tree. But there's no way to get it the way they say, where it's 3 unrelated individuals. And then the third problem is treating a phylogenetic tree, which is an evolutionary history of groups of individuals. It's taking that, but treating it as actual individuals represented at each of those branch points, which is not at all how that works. It's populations, it's groups, not specific people. And that's it. Those are the 3 errors. And it invalidates all this stuff with creationist attempts to try to find, evidence for the flood in either the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA. It all leans on those 3 errors every time.
It's always fun when you get a creationist to cite peer-reviewed science, especially when it's not their own. Like, what we're talking about now is somebody's contrived excuses trying to make something that looks like science.
Yeah, we should note they didn't collect any. We should note they didn't collect any of this data. This is Jensen and other people, Jeff Tompkins. They're taking data sets from other places and they're providing their interpretation of it. They're not actually doing the data collection. They're not doing the calculations, right? This is data that other people have gone out and collected and published, and then they're reinterpreting it is what's going on.
But when you do get creationists to cite peer-reviewed science from mainstream science sources, and they're not just doing the quote mine thing, when they actually put up a link to the original source, it's hilarious for me to, when most of these debates that I have are in writing, in which case I have the opportunity to read what they have cited, to realize that it doesn't say what they said it does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very often they'll quote a single sentence in it or part of that sentence. And if you quote the entire sentence, well, then you realize, well,
Changes it.
not only does it mean exactly the opposite of what they said, but they kind of had to know that it meant the opposite of what they said.
My favorite trick like that is when they quote the first line of the abstract, which, for anyone who's familiar with like how scientific writing works, the first line of the abstract is where you describe the problem that you're going to solve. So you say the abstract is the summary at the top of your paper. Before you get into any specifics, it's just a bing, 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 bing. You start with, here's a thing that we don't really know the answer to. And here's what people have done, and here's why it's wrong. And here's what we did. And then by the end of the abstract, you say, and here's the solution that we think we've come up with. And then the rest of the paper, describes in detail exactly what it is. They'll literally quote the first line of the abstract where they're saying, here's a problem that hasn't been adequately solved. They'll be like, look, they admit it. There's a problem. They haven't solved it. They don't know.
Countless times
Just
I've had
ignore the
citations
rest of the
various,
paper that solves it. Yeah.
I've had countless citations of Darwin saying exactly the same thing. They're,
Yeah.
Opponents to my theory will propose this problem, blah blah blah, and then he goes on to explain it
Explains why
eloquently,
it's not an
providing
issue.
all of the evidence to back that up. But no, they don't quote that part.
Yep.
All right, well, Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale, you have anything else you'd like to add? You want to close it up?
No, I'm good. I think we covered it. I think it was pretty straightforward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, sir. Do check out his channel, Creation Myths. I'll put the link down there below. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.